So my name is Hector Calderon Victoria. I'm the co-farmer and co-operator of Three Feathers Farm. We are located in Santa Clara County in the city of Morgan Hill. We are a 4.5 acre farm, mixed veggie operation, and we grow a variety of different crops. We started our farm in 2021 of May, and actually started our full operation in 2022 of spring. And so we're in our third year of organic farming here at this particular site. And so the challenges that we've been dealing with at this particular site when we began was that this site hadn't been grown in several years, around maybe 20 plus years. So this land was in pretty bad shape over a lot of compaction of driving vehicles over the closest side of the property, which is to the creek that runs behind our this particular site, and lots of brush and soil mounds that were sort of aggregated in the middle of the field. And honestly, there wasn't really much being grown on the site, or the soil was also very bare during the hottest times of the year. So a lot of the soil was highly impacted by the winter and fall rains. And so once we were able to begin that process, we began moving debris and soil from the middle of the field and taking it off the site that we were hoping to start growing in, along with on the other side of the property, which abuts to various homes and residential areas. There are several oak trees that were already in place and well established, and those oak trees hadn't been taken care of, so the branches were essentially all on the ground. You couldn't really see the fencing that was behind the property abutting to the residential property. And so we went through and cleaned all of the oak trees so that we wouldn't have to host mice and other critters that might be wanting to live underneath the debris of the oak trees. And I think that also created the accessibility to create still shade and a windbreak from these oak trees that are been here for several years. And then I think the only other challenge that we were running into was that we are only on a one well that's like a domestic well that's tied into a house that's on the exact same property that we farm on. Although there is a second well that has been sort of decommissioned but is functional, but doesn't have a meter and electricity, and been capped prior to the prior owners who were of this property. And so we are limited in terms of our water accessibility, of where we can get water to on the property, mainly towards the up front of the property, which is abutting to the main road of Watsonville that goes right through into this sort of part of the community. And then of course the only other thing was really trying to figure out what the design of the property would look like. And so that was a little hard for us and challenging in envisioning how we were hoping to sort of create the sort of foundation of this site, so that we would then have it be a fixed design for the ongoing years that we'd be in production here at the Morgan Hills. So physical activities was mainly moving logs, a lot of debris, and soil that was right in the middle of the field. So that was mainly picking up, trash, moving piles of dirt around the entire property, and then moving lots and lots of like wooden debris that was just piled in the middle of the field. I think the way that we began the designing was to think, in what directions were we hoping to like move around with the tractor. And so the property has a full-fledged mulched sort of trail on the outskirts of where we're growing so that we can get in and out of the field and have accessibility for the tractor to get in and out of our rows. I think the rows aren't exactly the way in which I had envisioned them to be in. However, that's sort of how it ended up being. So yeah, essentially we sort of split the main field, and then there's a small portion of the property where the second field is, which will be an orchard behind the home, which is maybe less than an acre, maybe closer to an acre, so like 0.75. And then the remainder is over here on the main field where we are still currently growing, but mainly towards the creek where the well is closest to. Yeah, I think the water availability was a huge one. As I had mentioned before, we're tied into a domestic well that goes into the home, and it's at the very back of the property near the creek. And so in doing that, that's how we ended up laying out our beds, was that that main line would be at the very back of the property, running all the way down, sort of like in a U shape across, going towards the highway that's called Watsonville Road. And that's how it really ended up shaping out in terms of what direction our beds were going to go in. So that's sort of the design, both through the irrigation and how our rows are set up here. And we try to keep fixed rows as much as we can, just because it's a little easier to know the predictability of like where our furrow is every year and where our main beds will be. I mean, the whole property gets a lot of sun. I think at the very back of the property where the creek is, there's a lot more of oak trees, really large old groves that have been here as a part of the creek, so that we do get a bit of a cast of shadow. And I think it's nice that we get that, primarily as it gets closer to the fall, we seem to see more of a shadow being casted. But over the summer, I think we get a lot of sun. We're on a very flat, leveled location, and so I don't think shade is much of a concern for us. And when there is, it really only happens in the morning, from like essentially from 6 to about 10, where there's some shadow casting from both the back oak trees of the property and then the trees that are adjacent to the residential homes. So the one thing I didn't mention, another challenge that we were having here as a part of our starting this project here at this farm, was that there were no prior fencing on the perimeter of the entire property, primarily where we were hoping to grow in. And so we had to put in a lot of T-posts that were about 12-foot long T-posts, and sort of like a wired fencing that's about 10 feet tall. And so that was a really big challenge that once we cleaned out the debris and cut the trees, our sort of third thing that we did here was to put up the fencing around the perimeter of the property that was going to be farmed at. And that took a really long time and a lot of resources for us to purchase both the T-posts and the fencings and rolls that would then create sort of this ability to keep out mainly deer and other really large animals from eating our crops when we are in production. I mean, one thing that we struggled with, because we don't really know the layout of this particular land, is that the domestic well has a underground 3-inch PVC pipe that is underground from the well to the home. And in doing the T-posts, we're right really close to the well and the creek, and so there's only so much spacing that you can figure out until you hit. We hit the actual 3-inch pipe on a really rainy day, and actually punctured the 3-inch pipe with the 10 or the 12-inch or the 12-foot T-post that eventually punctured and created a huge mess. So one thing to know is that that we learned here, and for any other future farmers who are hoping to do fencing, is you should really know where your irrigation is, primarily any underground piping that goes either to a home, or if you're in a more urban area, to know where irrigation lines are at, because it's just a headache when you puncture a really large line, and it creates more of a headache that maybe one didn't really necessarily need to come across. And I know that it was a really big deal, because there's also folks that live in the housing and on the property, and so it had to be fixed the same day. And we were right towards the end of the night, or the end of the day, which is towards dusk. And so we were working all night until about 11 at night, fixing a PVC pipe that wouldn't dry, and then also it was raining, so we had to put a tarp over the main hole that we were working in, and it just was not a very pleasant experience, to say the least. So always remember to check if there are underground irrigation or gas lines when you're doing PVC pipes or T-posts that need to be pounded in. So once all of these things went into place, we had a tractor, which we were fortunate enough to have on the property. However, we didn't have any implements for us to either disc, rototill, or use any sort of spader to churn our soil. And so we had to subcontract someone locally who had a little bit more experience of getting the soil prepped for us to put in our first cover crop in the year of 2021, before the 2022 year that we started. And so we subcontract someone to rip our soil, because it had been highly compacted over years of not being farmed, and then disking so that we can get some soil to be moved around the site, so that we can also put it down our cover crop seed. And so that was a really big challenge of not knowing who would be able to help us, not exactly knowing the lay of the land of terms of community members or farmers who might have the capability or capacity to support other beginner farmers in the area, and the idea that we just weren't well equipped to do the necessary work that we were hoping to do, which creates a lot of uncertainty for us, because there's a sort of a time and window for us to do those sort of things, and we're really dependent on rain during the winters for our cover crop. And then as well, after that, when the season gets started, that sort of not knowing uncertainty of getting the site prepped in time for planting on an appropriate time window that we may have. So trying to beat rains, or the soil not being fully dry when you need to get in. So those have been a big challenges for us primarily.